In Matthew's Gospel, chapter 22, Jesus says that the kingdom of heaven is like a big party, like a wedding feast. And he tells the story of a king who invites people to the son's wedding, and they do not come. And so in the end, the king's servants go out into the streets and gather all whom they found, both good and bad. So the wedding hall was filled with guests. Then at the end of the story, Jesus says this: "But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. Then the king said to him, 'Attendants, bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" Now, some commentators seem to suggest that the wedding clothes he is found to be without are the robes of righteousness. Matthew, they say, is referring to people who, although members of the Christian community, are guilty of unrepentance. They're committing sins or living lives that are wholly incompatible with a Christ-centered life. Now, I'm sure that that's been an issue for the church, but I'm less than convinced that unrepented sin is the chief fault of the man found to be wearing the wrong clothes at the wedding feast. I think there's a simpler explanation. The context of this story is a party. People will be dancing and making merry, but here is a man who's not participating. He's just sat there, and what's worse, he isn't even wearing the proper festive garments. He's accepted the invitation, he's come to the feast, but he's lost his enthusiasm for it. He's just sitting there. And probably he'll make some noises about babysitters or having to work in the morning, and he'll head for the door. This is a man whose heart has grown cold, whose sense of joy has waned, a man who has ceased to party. Things are really tough at the moment. People talk about the new normal, but none of this is normal. Socially distanced church is a misnomer. We're supposed to greet each other with the kiss of peace. Being fearful of the presence of others is not normal. Being unable to plan for the future because nobody knows when all this will end, that's not normal. So it is kind of unsurprising that some people have become disillusioned. They've lost much of their enthusiasm for the Christian life. They've lost their sense of joy. God seems a long way off. And it's not surprising. Having lost so much over the past 6 months, it's not surprising that we've also lost our way a bit, that we've lost our sense of joy, that we've lost our love for God. Now, if you feel that's true for you, then do not panic. You will not be thrown into the darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. The man in the story ended up there only after the king had come to him and addressed him as friend. The king is still with us. God is not absent. This is what the former Bishop of Oxford, John Pritchard, once said, and it's such an important message that we should always have it tattooed somewhere. I do live in Essex, after all. He says this: the spiritual writer Martin Laird puts it beautifully. God does not know how to be absent. The fact that most of us experience throughout most of our lives a sense of absence or distance from God is the great illusion that we're all caught up in. If God doesn't know how to be absent, there's no need trying to chase him as if trying to capture an exotic animal. It's better to stay put because God never leaves home. If anyone is absent, it's us. And with a culture of constant speed and trivial entertainment, that's not hard to imagine. Then he adds this: the answer, I believe, is to resist the desire to manipulate God into making regular live appearances on our own stage. Instead, to recognize the presence of God in the warp and weft of everyday life. God is a God of every last molecule of creation, and so by definition, God will be encountered much more often in the ordinary than in the spectacular, simply because there's so much more of it. Jesus is still king, and God is right here in the midst of all that is going on. And you know what? He's still king. He knows what he's about, and as Paul said, by the power at work within us, he's able to accomplish abundantly far more than all we can ask or imagine. God is here in the midst of this pandemic. Speaking of Paul, another of the readings set for today is Philippians chapter 4, where Paul says, "Rejoice in the Lord always." And again I say rejoice. Now, when Paul wrote this letter to the Philippians, things were pretty tough. When the church in Philippi was first planted, Paul was in prison. And here we are 10 years later, and he is in prison again. And yet he talks about rejoicing. You know, the Christian life isn't all a bed of roses. It doesn't feel like a party all the time. The brilliant Brennan Manning, in his book, The Ragamuffin Gospel, says this: when Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labour and are heavy burdened," he assumed we would grow weary, discouraged and disheartened along the way. He had no romantic notion of the cost of discipleship. He knew that following him was as unsentimental as duty, as demanding as love. He knew that physical pain, the loss of loved ones, failure, rejection, loneliness, abandonment and betrayal would sap our spirits, that the day would come when faith would no longer offer any drive, reassurance or comfort, that prayer would lack any sense of reality or progress, and that we would echo the cry of Teresa of Avila, "Lord, if this is the way you treat your friends, no wonder you have so few." You see, life will serve you lemons, and when it does, what do? We were hugely privileged this last week to have Rosemary Lane Priestley and Julie Gittos address our clergy study day in Colchester. And Rosemary reminded us to try and identify the positives in the midst of all that's going on. And there are some things, maybe around the way that we've rekindled our contact with others or developed a stronger sense of community, for which we can rejoice. When stuff happens, and let's be honest, as the bumper sticker says, stuff happens. When it does, God's loving creativity gets to work. When stuff happens, I often hear people quote Romans 8:28. "Never mind," they say, "all things work together for good for those who love God." But I don't think that is what Paul says. Now, it's not clear, and it's all to do with how you put the sentence together and what is the subject and the object and so on. So you have the things, the events, the stuff that happens, and you have God, and you have those who love God, and you have this odd word, synergeo, work together. And I think that what Paul is saying is that in all things, even in the midst of this pandemic, God is working together with those who love him, who are called according to his purposes, in order to bring about good. So in all things, God is at work, in and through us, for good. We're not in a bubble, we're not protected from the stuff that happens. But when it does, then we know that God rolls his sleeves up and gets to work with us and through us to bring about good. So Paul, when he's writing to the Philippians, has ended up in prison, which is a bit of a downer. But God gets to work, and Paul finds that it actually helps him to spread the gospel, and it's made his fellow believers more confident. Ha! Take that, you forces of evil. So look on the bright side. Not because life is some fairy tale in which nothing bad ever happens, but because when stuff happens, God is still God, and he can bring good out of the bleakest and darkest situations. So if life gives you lemons, look on the bright side. But also, and forgive the phrase, I'm sure it's an Americanism, if life gives you lemons, then sit with the suck. One writer says, sitting with the suck is not the same as wallowing in the suck. Sitting with the suck means life gives you lemons and you must decide you're going to be with the lemons. You're not going to yell at them or kick them or throw them at someone, or actually you might yell at them. You might get really mad at all the lemons. But the anger or frustration or sadness or righteous indignation or despair you feel about the lemons won't be constant. It will ebb and flow and change. You'll know this because you're sitting with the lemons. It might take a few minutes of sitting with the lemons. It might take a few months. Lemons have a really long shelf life, but it's not the lemon's fault. You're just going to stay with your hurt and your pain because the only way out is through. And then one day you might think, I suppose I could try to make lemonade. Or perhaps you think, I do need just a little bit of lemon zest for this dinner recipe. Or you might just say, this kitchen stinks. I'm just going to grind up the lemons in the garbage disposal. Sitting with the suck is about accepting what life throws at you. It's not about indulging in idle speculation as to what might have been if things had turned out differently. It is about being done with regret, shunning any sense of guilt and refusing to be the victim. If life gives you lemons, then just face the fact that for today at least, lemons are what's on the menu. Stephen Fry says, lemons are amongst the best and most wonderful gifts of nature. They are adaptable, versatile and delicious, a slice for your gin and tonic, juice to zing life into salads, stews, fish and seafood, oil and sweetness from the rind and zest that is pure and perfumed and precious. They're a staple of what doctors agree is the best dietary regimen we can follow. So if life gives you lemons, shout, thank you, life, thank you. So back to the party. The king notices a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe, and he says to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe? Jesus addresses us as friend. Friend, my companion, you are the one who has joined with me. How come you are no longer wearing your garments of gladness? Who's stolen your love of life? What has diminished your sense of joy? Friend, what has happened to make you like this? When questioned, the man in the story remains speechless. Don't remain speechless. Your friend Jesus is concerned for you. Going with him back into the throng of your fellow partygoers may be the last thing that you feel you want to do, but go with him. He will look out for you. And as you go with him, tell him how you feel. Share with him what has caused you to lose your sense of joy so that you may find that it is restored. Think back to when you first accepted the invitation to be with him. Think how you felt, your joy, your enthusiasm, your love. You see, there's a kind of spiritual middle age. It's like ordinary middle age. And if we're not careful, we can lose our way a bit. So the writer to the Hebrews says this. He says, remember those earlier days when you stood your ground, when you knew you had better and lasting possessions. So he says, don't throw away your confidence. Or as Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. So if you feel that you're at the wedding feast, but you've lost your garments of gladness, if life has served you lemons, then turn to God, who in Jesus addresses you as friend. The story that Jesus told is all about invitation, because God is a God who invites us, who holds his arms outstretched as he bids us come to him. Come, all you who are thirsty. Come, all you who labour and are heavy laden. Come, all you who are beaten and broken and lost. Come, all you who are searching and looking for what you don't have. Come, for the one who invites you will give you the water of life, refreshing your soul, filling you with love and joy and peace. He'll give you rest. He will mend what is broken, heal what is beaten, and he will take you up in his arms and restore you to where and who you need to be. And he is the end of all our searching, the goal of all our longing, the one to whom our coming is a coming home. So if you feel that you are at the wedding feast, but you've lost your garments of gladness, if life has served you lemons, then just accept the invitation to be reincorporated, embraced, held by the God who loves you and who longs for you to rejoice once more.